All right, so this is okay. So what are the three options for creating a base data set?
So the source, right?
Mm-hmm.
FTP, SFTP file and custom report.
All right, so the options for creating a base data set using SFTP is very similar to how we create a base data set using a file. The only difference is the file is placed on a secured location. Okay, right. Proxy does Logan McNeil. Okay, so data catalog, and I want to create a base data set using a file. All right, so I'll go to the create option, create from SFTP. All right, so the first difference is, see, unlike a file from a local machine wherein you yourself manually select a file, right? However, when you are creating a base data set from an SFTP server, the idea is one or multiple files are placed on that secure location. So when your integration runs, it will automatically process that file, right? It will pick those files based on either the file name you have given or file name pattern you have given. So what is this pattern? See, your integrations can consume multiple files at the same time. So let's say you have 10 files, right? Obviously, because in a single file, you cannot give, let's assume, a million rows of data, or you have different types of data to be consumed. So then this is how your file name pattern looks. Let's say WB underscore Feb 7th, right? Prism file underscore 1 dot CSV, right? And then you have a second file which is prism file 2.csv and 3.csv and 4.csv and so on and so forth. So in that case, obviously, because you have multiple files, instead of giving a file name, you can give a file name pattern. Now, what is the file name pattern? In file name pattern, you can basically define placeholders, right? So what are those placeholders? You can either say question mark or asterisk. Okay, so this is how your file name pattern would look. Because you have multiple files, you'll put a file name pattern. Now what is that file name pattern? In that, you'll place a placeholder which could be either question mark or asterisk. Okay, now question mark, it specifies that there is one character to be defined, and asterisk if there are more than one characters. Now if you see, you can have more than one file, right? You can have 1 and 2 and 3 and 10 and 11 and 12. So there is a possibility that there would be more than one character. So wherever you place a question mark, a star mark or an asterisk, system would know there could be multiple. System would check for this pattern, and then here it would see what is the fillers available. So basically, system would pick anything which has this name followed by anything else, multiple rows. However, if you put a question mark, then system would see, okay, there should be one character which should be given here. Make sense?
Yes, so we can put the asterisk at the start as well, like if our file name has, like,
Yeah,
the
we can.
yeah, okay, yeah.
So we can put anywhere. So you can consume up to a maximum of 1,000 files. Okay.
Okay.
So the idea is you can create a data set by transferring data from an SFTP. Now, if you remember when we spoke about files, what did we say file is suitable for? So file is suitable when you have data which wouldn't change very often, right? Because that's
Yes.
where then you can manually define that or upload the data. But here the advantage is once you have defined the file name or file pattern, now you can schedule an integration and that integration would automatically run and automatically go ahead and fetch the files that are placed, any new files that are placed, right? So the idea is this option is usually used. Again, this is the general recommendation, but even if some file doesn't change, and you can still use it as on an SFTP server, right? Okay, this is usually used when the source data changes often, right? Okay, what are the recommendations or what are the limitations? As we discussed, the number of files must be less than 1000, right? The second thing, the time to transfer data in a single integration run, in a single integration run should be less than 6 hours. So anything which takes more than that because it consumes the server resources, Workday would go ahead and terminate it. So this is not so much as a technical limitation as a limitation which has been put by Workday, right? Because obviously it's a cloud-based system. So different organizations are consuming server resources. So anything which takes more than 6 hours will be terminated by Workday. Okay, the third thing, each file must be less than 1 GB if it is compressed, and it should be less than 10 GB if uncompressed, right? So you can have 1000 files, up to 1000 files, each up to 1 GB, right? As long as the overall data transfer less than takes less than 6 hours, right? Okay, as we discussed, file names or file name pattern may be defined, right? When in star, it specify 0 or more characters, right? Whereas if you put a question mark, it specify exactly one character. Okay, then you would obviously specify the SFTP server details, the directory, uh, the authentication method, username, password, and so on and so forth. Now, what is this use temp file? So what happens is when the data is imported, it will first be imported into a temporary file, right? After the data import is complete, then it is from temporary file, it is then imported into your base data set, right? Okay, so once again, if you select this option, data is not directly imported into base data set. It is first imported into a temporary file after all the data load has finished. Then from there it is transferred to a base data set. Now this is usually recommended when you are importing huge amount of data,
Okay.
right? So that if any data fail happens, that way you are not in a situation wherein half your data is imported and other half is not imported, or maybe before one data load completes your second integration run has automatically started, right? So after the data load has complete, system would automatically delete the temporary file,
Okay, got it.
right? Okay, so wherever this checkbox is selected, after your data has been retrieved, this would be deleted from the source. So two things: Workday imports data into a temporary file. From there, it imports into base data set, and after your data load has finished, then the temporary file is deleted. But here, when we are saying delete after retrieval, we are talking about the source file. So what happens is, once the data load is complete, you want the source file in your SFTP server to be deleted so that there's no confusion that this file has already been read,
Okay, so we will
right?
first import the data from SFTP, and then if we check mark on it, the source file from the FTP will get deleted.
SFTP automatically be
Okay.
deleted. Because what happens is, let's say there are 10 files. Now my integration has already read 5 files or 6 files or 10 files. The person who's placing that file wouldn't know how many files have been read, what is the status, right? He or may not have access to the Prism system because he is from some third party system who's only responsible for placing the data from his own legacy system, right? So when we select this option, this removes the confusion. Once a file has been completely read, it will be removed from the SFTP source, right? And then new files can
Okay.
be placed. Okay,
Yep.
but the only catch is, if your file deletion fails, then your whole integration will fail for whatever reason. If your integration is not able to, so even if it has read all the data, and then when trying to delete that file, if the file deletion fails, then your integration would be failed as well, right? So if for any reason Workday is not able to delete the file, then your integration would be failed. All right. Okay, so use temp file. When this option is selected, what happens? System, it writes the imported data to a temporary file in Workday, right? And that file would have some random name. After the data import is complete, Workday automatically removes the file, right? Again, you might want to enable this option. So this is not required that you have to enable this option always, but what are the recommendations to consider if this option has to be enabled? If data import takes a very long time to complete, right? And there are chances of failure, right? Or maybe your data import might not finish before the next schedule time to import data from server. Okay, the third option, delete after retrieval. So this, what does it do? It deletes the file on the SFTP server after the data is imported into dataset. However, if Workday is not able to delete the file, the data retrieval fails. So maybe the user you're using, it doesn't even have authorization to delete that files, right? Though this option is given, this is not recommended. This is not to be used because you can directly use uncompressed data, right? When I say compress, you are sending some data through a zip file.
Yep.
Okay, will not be able to move to the next screen. Obviously, we don't have any SFTP address, and that is required. But the next screen is basically the same thing. You can schedule your integration the way we have seen with the file, right? You can then define the integration run now, or you want to schedule that integration. So having discussed that, I think we can talk about the data retrieval integration schedule as well. So let's say this is my base data set, right? And where is my base data set? Worker details. Now let me go ahead and open this. So initially when we created this base data set, it basically loaded data whatever was there in the custom report. Subsequently, yesterday we again reloaded the new data. But every time data changes, and if you see, worker details will change and company details would change. Maybe not as often as worker details, but in terms of workers, I'll have new employees joining, I'll have old employees leaving. So I cannot go ahead and run this integration every day. What I want is this base data set to automatically import data whenever there is some new or on a daily basis. Okay, so what I can do is I can either run the integration now, which is what we did yesterday, or we can edit the integration details. So if I view the integration details, you see it is selected to, we have been running it manually, right? So every time if you see, initially on 7th, we loaded the data, and then yesterday we again loaded the data. Okay, so now what I can instead do is I can edit the integration details. Now this is true even for SFTP as well. Now here, so this is my initial transport protocol, which is what was selected when I initially created the base data set, wherein we selected the custom report. I'll click OK. The next screen is where we define the run frequency. So instead of running it now, I can run it on a daily, weekly basis. Let's say I want to run it on a daily occurrence. I'll select OK. Now here I can define the integration schedule, right? So I want it to run every weekdays, right? Or it records every 5th day or every 10th day, right? I would be defining the start time, the time zone in terms of which the start time has to be defined, and the catch up behavior. Now, what is catch up behavior? Okay, so let's say your integration is supposed to run every day, right? So I'm saying run every day, right? Okay, now let's assume on a Saturday or a Sunday or any other day, because of outage, your integration couldn't run, right? In that case, how do you want the integration to behave? Do you want the integration, if you see, if you don't specify the catch-up behavior, so if you select the option as none, then what system would do? System would run, so my integration did not run on Friday because of an issue. It did not run on, let's say, uh, Saturday, and it did not run on Sunday, right? Okay, now when Monday integration runs, then how many times do I want the integration to run? Do I want the integration to run 3 times, or do I want the integration to run just once? So usually, because this is a custom report, it would have all the latest data. I'll just say run it now once. So it also depends on how my data source has data. Okay, so let's say my custom report, it runs every day or every day as per the filter criteria on the custom report. It checks how many people have been hired from morning 12 a.m. or 12 p.m. in the night till 11:55 p.m. in the night. And 11:55 p.m. is when my integration runs. So this integration runs at 11:55 p.m. in the night. right? It checks it checks so this integration runs, it calls this custom report. This custom report has a filter so that it only pulls data for the last 24 hours, which is from
Okay.
12 in the morning. So if this is the case, if you see if you only run it once on Monday, then it will not pull your full data, because on Monday it will only get data for Monday. Make sense? So it really
Yes.
depends on how your data source is structured. Right? Now in our case it doesn't matter, because if you see our custom report, it always gets me all the employees in the system who are active as of today, right? And our integration is basically a replace integration. So in a replace integration, my custom report always has the latest worker count. So even if that integration did not run on Friday and Saturday and Sunday, when it runs on Monday, it will get entire data from the custom report. So that is why it is extremely critical. Though these options look simple, replace or append, you have to decide on these options in connection with how your data source is sending you data. All right. So catch up behavior basically defines how many times your integration should run in case there is a failure.
Okay.
Right. Now this integration run, it is for data retrieval, right? Because this is for retrieving data from the data source. So there are two kinds of integration runs, and we'll talk about those. The first one is data retrieval, because with this integration run, we are trying to retrieve data from Workday, from the data source, whatever the data source is. The same logic also applies when you define an integration run for SFTP. So even over there, you are retrieving data from the data source, right? So this is known as a data retrieval process or a data retrieval future process. All right. Okay, so that was a data retrieval from SFTP. Okay, now let's look at the Prism calculated fields. Now, what are Prism calculated fields, or in general, what are calculated fields? Calculated fields. So if you see, Workday has already given us a lot of fields. So if I go ahead and search for any custom report, uh, in fact, the same one that we ZF03, right? Let's look at this report. So in this report, I have only used Workday delivered fields. So what are Workday delivered fields? These are all the fields that Workday has given us. So if I go to the report definition, if I click on the additional actions, you can see these are all Workday delivered fields, and this is the field type. And Workday gives a short description. So for example, I have age, again a Workday delivered field. Now many times what happens is, okay, about business object yet, right? Are you aware of a business object and a data source? All right. In that case, you understand the calculated field logic as well, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so you're already aware of it. Sure. So
Yep.
similar to how we create calculated fields on a report, we can also create calculated fields on our data sets. All right. Now these calculated field functions are very similar to how we create calculated fields in a custom report. And they are also very similar to how we do Excel calculations. Okay, so now have since our data set is complete, let's go ahead and look at a few Prism related calculations. Again, these are very similar, very simple. So let me go back to the data catalog, BDS01, DDS01. This is our final data set, and I want to edit it. Okay, now if you see on the stage statistics, it shows me overall the stage ID, the total number of fields, and if there are any calculated fields. So here we can see all the calculated fields in the system. Okay, I want to add a new field. I would go ahead and do that, right? So I just need to click on plus, and this would add a new field. Now, normally when I click on any field, it shows me the field type information. So it gives me the type of that field and the field statistics. But when I click on a calculated field, apart from field information, it also shows me the functions library. So what is this functions library? The different functions which are available for creating your calculated field. Now here I can directly search for a function, or I can go through this list and select a function, right?
Yep,
Now
it's like Excel, right?
it's like Excel,
Yeah.
right? Now when I expand this, if is the only difference is, if you see in terms of date, we have a single function called date difference, right? Wherein we can find the difference between two dates in terms of years and months and so on and so forth. Here, for
Mm-hmm.
each one of these, there is a separate function. So if you see, there is a function to find difference between two dates in terms of dates, in terms of hours, in terms of milliseconds, minutes, seconds, years. So there is a separate function for each of those calculations. Whereas in normal calculated field, there's just one calculated field, date difference, right? The second thing, if I go ahead and expand this, it will show me a short syntax of how the
Yes.
calculation works. It gives me short description, a syntax, and an example, and the return value. So the return value is determined by the type of field. So if you want to find the difference between two dates, it will also always return value of type double. Now how can I change it? By using a manage field stage. So you can use a manage field stage to basically go ahead and uh, change the field type. Okay, so once again, I want to rename this field. So I want to find the age of the employee on hire. I'm just giving it the field name. My field type is non-editable. It depends on the function that I'm using. So now I go to functions, I select one of these functions. We'll go through a few of these. I want to find the year difference. I'll click on plus. So the moment I click on plus, the function gets added. Okay. Now, if the moment I enter something, Workday automatically shows me other functions which are available. So the moment I entered A, it is showing me all the functions and a short description of those functions. Okay, however, what I want is to find the age difference between two fields which are available here. So what are those fields? I want to find, so basically my requirement is to find the age of the employee when the employee was hired, right? So for that, I need the difference between the date of birth and the hire date. So here what I need is, I need to find the difference between hire date and date of birth. So how do I add these fields? I'll simply add a square bracket, opening square bracket, not here, here. The moment I do that, system automatically adds a closing bracket and shows me the different fields which are available, right? Now I can select hire date. comma. Again, I'm adding a opening square bracket, and then I want to select date of birth, and I'll click on this checkbox. If there are any errors, system would show me those errors. Right? Let's move to the right. As I mentioned, the return type is double because the calculation for this field always returns double. Now, obviously, I don't want to find age difference in terms of double, right? In terms of these many precisions. Then I can add a new manage field stage and change the output type or field type to numeric.
Change the decimals as well, right?
Not here. So again, that's what I was saying. Here you cannot change because the return type for year difference, if you see, is always double. So
Okay.
for double, the decimal precision is defined. So how can I change the decimal precision? By using my manage field stage.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Or let me do one thing. Let me come in here, delete this field here. I'll add. So what will happen is now I'll not be able to change anything here. I'll have to add a new manage field stage. So if you see here, it doesn't show me this new calculated field that I have added.
Yes.
So when I add a new stage, that's where this new calculated field would show up. And there I can change the output of this field. Okay, the next one. There are, so let's say there are some, if in reporting, have you worked on eval expression and eval expression band?
Yes. By using true, false, and all, we used to get the
Exactly.
constant. It's
Right.
constant, yeah.
So similar to that, we have a function called case here. So we have a
Okay.
case related function, again similar to as you mentioned in Excel. So now we have 34 fields in total, and one of which is a calculated field. I want to add a new calculated field. Again, I would rename it, and I'm calling it the function. Okay, so what I want is, if you want to search your fields, you can directly go here and search from here. Okay, so we have org level from top. Yeah, org level from top. So you see here, it is showing me all the organization levels. So let's say this is the structure I have. My top level organization on my level 3 organization is a business uh, line, under which maybe I have hubs, which is my level 4 organizations are my hubs. Under hubs, I have my divisions, right? So let's say human resources is my business line, under which payroll is my hub, under which payroll India is my division, within which I may have different departments, right? Within which I may have different groups, and within which I may have different teams, right? And overall at the top, I have my company or my head office, let's assume. So this is how my organization is structured. Now, instead of showing these numbers 3 or 4 or 5, I want to replace these values with these meaningful values, right? Because no one will understand what is 3 or what is 4. Or obviously, uh, only those people who know it would understand. So I want is replace certain values with new values. Okay, so for that, I can use a function which is a case function. So let's click here. The function that I want to use is a case function. Now case is a logical function, right? So again, if I expand this, it shows me syntax, a short description, and detailed description is available on community. And it also gives me an example. So it gives me an example of the syntax, case, when, Then this is my comparison, gender is equal to M, and then this is the syntax. So this is my condition, case when my input condition, which I'm saying is gender is equal to M, then what should be returned? Male. Else when gender, so again when, then again my second condition F, then return female, else everything is false, return unknown, right? So it gives me an example and the syntax as well. So now I'm going to add this. Okay, now here I may have multiple conditions, so this space might not be sufficient. I have this space. So when I click on here, it would allow me to define a detailed condition.
Okay, so this is an expand view of.
Right. So now I can add my starting square bracket, and what is my, so what I'm saying, case when org level from top is equal to 1, right? I can use and or conditions as well. So I'm saying or, right? Again, org level from top is equal to 2, then return what? Then I want this to return head office. Else is my final condition. My second condition is when, I'll put this in caps, again org level from top is equal to 2, then return, this is a business line. When org level from top is equal to 3 is equal to 4, then return hub, and so on and so forth. When, let's quickly complete this, org level from top is equal to 5, then return division, and okay, let's complete this. Org level from top is equal to 6, then return department, else for everything else return team or project or group, whatever, and my condition ends. I want to apply this condition. Let's see if there are any errors. If there are any errors, system would show me those errors here. Right? So wherever org level is 3, system is replacing it with business line, else it is replacing it with hub, else it is replacing with head office, and so on and so forth. Right? I want to rename this field and I'm calling it, yeah, this is function. Okay, now what I can also do is, now this is a field of return type is text. If a return type is text, for example, I have concatenate, substring, many other functions as well, similar to how we have functions in so let me add a new field. So with respect to text, we have all the normal text related functions. I can get the substring, I can concatenate two strings, and so on and so forth. I can reverse a string, and so on and so forth. So there are quite a few text related functions. Again, the details of all of these functions and examples are given on community. I can check and give some of those examples for you, but here as well, so all of these examples are given. right? So I can reverse things, I can concatenate two things, and so on and so forth. Okay, now there are some instance related functions as well, right? So for example, and if you know, even in normal reporting, we have these instance related functions, we have sum related instances, we have count related instances, and so on and so forth. So what I need is, for each employee in additional jobs, I want to find the number of additional jobs these employees are on. So some employees are not on any additional jobs, some employees are on one additional job, there could be other employees who are on more than one additional job. So what I want is a sum of all the, or the count of all the additional jobs that the employees are performing. In reporting, we have sum related instances or count related instances. Those are the functions that we use in reporting. Now here we have a similar function. So under instance, I have a function called, this is a comparison function. I can check whether instance is equal to certain value. Similar to how we extract multiple instance, here as well we can create multi-instance. Okay, I am adding a very simple function to simply count the number of instances. Count instances of additional jobs. So if I scroll to the right, okay, so again, wherever there's no value, obviously it gives null. Here if you see, this worker has two additional jobs. So if I scroll to the right, this worker has actually two additional jobs. And there could be some other workers who have one additional jobs. And I'm calling it number of additional jobs or additional job count. Okay, now if you see, what happens is when we created our field called function, now we don't need org level from top, right? I don't want people to see that org level from top field because we have added this field called functions, right? So I want to hide the other field. Now one way to do that is through manage field stage, right? Because I've added this function field, I don't need org level from top. At least I don't need it to be visible. So what I can do is I can hide a field. I simply have this option called hide this field. So if you see, the description goes hide this field from stages that follow. So in this stage it would still be visible, but any subsequent stage the field would be hidden and cannot be accessed in any other calculations. Okay, so when do you want to hide a field? Let's say you have individual salary of employees. So you have total base pay amount for each worker. Now you don't want workers to see the individual base pay amount, but maybe you want to see the total base pay amount, right? So it is fine for your HR, let's assume, or your data analyst or someone to see the overall base pay that is being paid in a supervisory org. But you don't want them to see the individual base pay that each worker gets. So again, you can build calculations to get those averages or sums or so on and so forth, but you can hide these individual amounts. So hiding a field could be for various reasons, right? You have created some field only for calculation and you don't want it to be visible, similar to how we create reporting calculated fields, or there is uh, some uh, field which you do not want to be visible because of security reasons, sensitive data, you can hide it. Okay, now if you see, I cannot go ahead and directly add or perform any numeric calculations on currency related field. So to perform any numeric calculations on currency related field, I would have to first extract the numeric value. So for that, again, I have calculations or functions available which allows me to extract the numeric value, or there are functions available to extract the currency code, or there are functions available to convert a numeric value into currency field by adding the currency code. I want to add a new field. I only want the total base pay amount. So if I go to functions library and under conversion, if you see, I have extract amount. Extract amount takes a currency value and extracts the numeric amount, right? Similarly, I have extract to currency. So if I want to convert a text value into currency value, if it is not properly identified, I can do a to currency. So there are a number of current conversion functions. Similarly, extract code, instead of amount, I want to extract the currency code. So out of total base pay amount, I just want to extract the currency in which the employee is being paid. I can use extract code, or I can use extract amount, right? So I want extract amount of total base pay amount. So this is total base pay amount, right? I want to extract the amount of it. Right? So again, now I only have the numeric value, and the return type for this is numeric. Okay, now similar to this, I can also use one calculated field function in another calculated field function. So let's say this base salary of the employees, where is it? I want to find the employee with the maximum base salary, right? Maximum base salary by, let's say, by the employee's gender, right? Okay, I would click on add field, right? I want to add, let's say, the max base pay by supervisory organization. So in a supervisory org, I want to basically see what is the maximum base pay of the employee. So for that, I have a number of functions available. These are called window functions. In window, you have max, min, average, and so on and so forth. So what I need is the maximum. I'm clicking on max, right? Similarly, I can find minimum, I can find other options as well. Okay, so what is that I want to find the maximum of? Employee, oh, employee base pay. So this is a syntax which Workday has automatically added. So I want to find the maximum of employees base pay over what? Over for the supervisory org. So maximum base pay by supervisory organization. So I want to select, let's say, the supervisory org name, right? Now, how do I want to order it? Again, by the base pay in a descending order, right? So again, I'm selecting employee base pay, right? And in what order? Descending order, right? So once again, I want to get the maximum of employees base pay in each supervisory organization, and then I want to order the result based on employees base pay, right, in a descending order. Let's apply this. All right, so let's see. Now all my results are, first thing, sorted based on the supervisory org. Let's quickly check where is my supervisory org. The supervisory org name. Okay, so if you see, the first three results are for those supervisory orgs. Obviously they don't have name. And then in IT services group, it is again sorting it based on the supervisory org. The reason is we have grouped it by the supervisory org.
Yes. One question over here, like we are still getting null value. So the null value will eliminate once we create a PDS, right?
Yes, because in Prism
Okay.
you have the concept of null. You don't have the concept of null in Workday reporting. And how do we do Workday reporting? In the context of data source. So when we create a published data source, that's when we'll see that Workday creates a data source or Prism data source, and in that Prism data source no null values will be there.
Okay.
Okay, so what I want is by supervisory org but also by employees gender. So let me add gender as well, and let's see. There are some good examples for this. I can try and get you some those examples. Okay, so now let's see this supervisory org 128037, row number 4. So first little row number 14, right? So let's look at supervisory org name 14 IT services group. Okay, and so from 5th onwards, actually 14, 15 until 18 we have IT services group. Let's look at gender now and see how Workday is. Where is gender? Yeah, all right. So if you see 14, 15 is female. So how is Workday dividing it? For all null gender, it is calculating separately female. Again, 14th and 15th is female. So it is getting maximum for female and then remaining are male. So it is within a supervisory org, it is dividing, doing 3 different partitions. Right, so this is full list available. If you have access to community, you'll see each of these examples available there, right? And there are proper use cases defined. So for each of these functions which are available, you can go through them. Obviously I have not used all of them myself, but they are pretty simple to use. Any questions?
eliminate that
Okay.
decimal. So
Mhm.
how would we do that?
Sorry,
Because we come
sorry.
across a lot of numeric values. So yeah,
I
we
didn't
come
get
across
that.
a lot of numeric values,
Hmm.
like while creating a calculated field, some of our hello, am I audible now?
Yeah, yeah,
So I
you
was
are.
saying, if you see most of our calculated fields have, yeah,
Hmm.
so most of our calculated fields have decimals like 5-6 digits.
Right,
So if I want
right.
to do it as two decimals,
Manage
so
it.
how will I do that? Yeah. So I just
Okay,
want to understand that. Yeah. Okay.
sure. So for that, because a lot of these have been added within my current manage field stage, I'll not be able to do any modifications here. I would have to add a new manage field stage, right? We could have built our calculations. Let me just say done for now. So what we could have done is we could have even built our calculated fields in this join. And then after this join, we could have done everything here, all manage. So even over here, I could have added my calculated fields. So all those calculated fields which I added here, instead of in this manage field stage, I could have added those calculated fields in this join. And then finally, through this manage field stage, I could have done all tidying up in a one single go. Because I had already added this manage field stage, I simply created my calculations here, right? So now because of that reason, I'm having to add a new manage field stage. Now here I can do all the modifications that I need. So the first thing, the age on hire and all of these, if you see, these are double. Now what I want is an even employee base pay amount, and these are all values which have multiple decimal. So first let's look at age on hire. So age on hire, no one is expecting 10 decimals. So the first thing that I'll select is numeric, and when I click here I can define the values. So now I
Okay. Got
only want even for employee base pay amount. Currently, oh, I cannot see. Currently it is 6 digits. I want it to be 2 digits. This as well. So all field related configurations you can do through your manage field stage. So now when I say done, right? So here we have employee base pay, age on hire, which is only 2 decimal places. Here it was showing up to 7 or 8 decimal places, right? So this is how it looked earlier. Even the uh, other functions, they were all 6 or 7 decimal places. Now they are all 2 decimal places. Okay, so what happens is many of these cases we simply add numeric values. So one of the project that I worked for, this is what we did. So we ultimate, have you come across or worked on something called scorecards in Workday?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so Workday scorecard is again a part of reporting. Obviously, it is part of advanced reporting. So what happens in scorecard is you you get the overall trends in the system. So for example, you can get let's say the number of employees, head count in Jan, the female count, the gender count, the employee type, the employees on international assignment. So you want to get these numbers on a monthly basis. For this, we create something called scorecards. Now scorecards are created using composite reporting. I'll not go in detail, but I'll quickly show you. Right? Let me just save it. So for that, in what we do is in Prism. Now, why am I talking about scorecards here? Because if you want to build your scorecards, if you see, scorecards are nothing but summarizations, right? So count of your employees, count of your females, count of your males. Now, when you say count, system would not be able to count gender, female, male here. So what we do is we create a lot of case related functions. So we'll say case when male, then 1, case when female, then let's say uh, 2 or zero 0.5 or whatever, right? Similarly, when employees on international assignment, add 1, or change it with 1. And finally, what we do is through scorecards, we simply add up those values.
Okay.
Right? So how do we create a scorecard? So again, as I mentioned, will not go in details. So this is where we define those scorecards. So there are quite a few scorecards created. So I created one, this is just one sample value. So in these scorecards, we define different metrics. So in the metrics, this is where we can define different metrics. So if you see this metric I have defined to get the head count, right? Similarly, I could have defined a metric to get the termination count, to get the employees on international assignment, to get the employees based on their age, and so on and so forth. So we create these scorecards, right? We create these metrics, and finally we create reports which are used to publish those metrics. So this is a complete process that Workday has given. And for that, in Prism Analytics, what we do is instead of having these values, males, females, or additional jobs, yes, no, we create these numeric values, and through scorecards, which is simply a metrics report, here we simply create those calculations. And finally, we publish those calculations through through Composite Report. So if I open it, okay, so actually, if you see, this is a composite report, and here I'm getting those headcount trends. So this is how we create different dashboards. Again, this is a completely different aspect of your reporting in Workday.
Okay.
Okay, any which ways. So for that, what do you do? If your client says that they need scorecards, the prerequisite, you need to get that data in your Prism for building your scorecards. So scorecards are nothing but the high level trends, right? Which is basically your count, your summarizations. So if your client needs summarizations, you have to ask them on what values do they need summarizations. And for those values, you have to create data in Prism. So for example, they say they need head count. Again, let me go back. So if they say they need head count, then you should be able to count your head count, right? And how do I count my head count? I have created a simple matrix report for this. So this is my matrix report that I have created. In this, I have just added one matrix, but then you can add any number of metrics. So if you see, this is on my Prism data source that I created. So obviously you can only do summarizations on your numeric values. You cannot go ahead and do a summarization on female or male, right? So you'll first have to create these summarization fields. And for that, your case function is very important. So you will see a lot of case related functions being utilized. Okay, any which ways, that was not part of core Prism, but I just wanted to give you an idea. So because Prism becomes a data feed into scorecards. So in the context of security, if you see, when we initially created our custom report, right? We had security applied on that custom report. Obviously, only those people who have access to the custom report would be able to see it and within that custom report they would only be able to see data which is relevant for them, right? But the moment this data is brought into Prism environment, right, if I have access to the base data set, I can see all the data, even though I didn't have access to see all data in the custom report. Make sense? Because custom report has the contextual security. I'll only be able to see data which is relevant for me when I run a custom report. When I say I as an end user, but if I have access to the data set, I would be able to see all data in the data set. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now this is how. So remember this point. So securing data in a data set or your Prism security. So this is how your Prism security works. Now we know that we discussed this initially, that in Prism it's basically a 5-phase process. We first get data into base data set, we then create derived data sets, and then we using derived data set, we transform our data, we apply security, we publish our data, and then we analyze our data. Okay, so similar to that 5-phase process, corresponding to each of those phases, Workday applies or Workday security model applies. Okay, so the phase 1 and phase 2. So what is phase 1 and phase 2 in Prism data management workflow? So the phase 1 is create base data sets.
Which data set?
And what is phase 2? Then we transform
BDS.
the data using derived data sets.
Derived data set.
Okay, so phase 1 and phase 2, I can simply say create and edit data sets. So this is the first phase, or these two phases. How does Workday security operate? Okay, now we already mentioned that a data set, it includes metadata. So what is metadata? Basically the table schema or the data set schema. What is the field type? How many fields are there? The order of those fields, the format of those fields. That is metadata, and a subset of data. So what is the data set? A data set includes the definition of the data as well as a subset of data, which is basically example rows.
Yes.
Right?
Ideally, the data within the data, right? That is
Exactly.
yeah.
Right. Okay. Now the idea is only those people, those who have access to the data set will be able to access both metadata and data rows. So whatever data rows are displayed or the example rows are displayed, they'll be able to access all of that if I have access to view a data set. Right? Now, how do I control access to the data set? Okay, so in Prism, you can basically control who has access to the data sets, right? By first using or configuring Workday security domains to create, edit, or manage data sets. So the first thing I can, through domains, I can basically configure who has access to create a data set, who has access to view a data set, who has access to manage a data set. So if you don't have access to the data set at all, obviously you'll not have access to any data within the data set. right? So how do I control access to the data within my data sets, my base data sets and derived data set? Is by controlling access to the data sets
Data
itself.
sets. Yep.
But as I mentioned, if you have access to the data set, unlike report wherein you may have access to the report, but you'll only be able to see details of your own employees, not for employees in US. So in reporting, you have this contextual security access. Whereas in a data set, base and derived data set, you don't have that contextual security access. Okay, the second aspect is through data set sharing. Now we'll talk about data sharing in a bit, right? But remember, as we discussed, access to the data set is always unconstrained. This means that any user who can view or manage a data set will be able to view all fields and data. When I say data, obviously the example rows. No one can see full data up to a maximum of 20K. And data in the data set regardless of the source. So regardless of how I created the data set, I may have created through a custom report and I don't even have access to that custom report. I may have created that data set through an SFTP or a file and I don't even have access to that SFTP location. But once that data has been brought into a data set and I have access to that particular data set, I can view all data within that data set. Right? So the idea is when you create a data set from a Workday report as an example, then what happens? Workday removes all security domains configured on the business object of the report. So the only way to control access of the data which is part of your data set is by controlling who has access to view, create or manage your data set, or by data set sharing. So what is the data set sharing? If I am the owner of a data set, I can share the data set with others in view mode or edit mode. So the users who have created a data set, right, or they have been made data set owner, they can share these with other users and grant them different levels of permissions. So again, I have created one data set and to this data set, I can give you access. Maybe only view access, maybe both view and modify access. All right. So this is phase 1 and 2. Okay. Now what is the next one? The next one is we apply security. So the next one is apply security to the published data. So if you see, any data in the data set is always unconstrained, in the sense any data which is part of the data set, and if you have access to the data set, you can view that data. Now what do I mean by applying security to the published data? Okay, so when you apply any security restrictions on your data set, Workday doesn't apply those restrictions on the data set, right? Instead, when you publish that data set, and this is something we discussed yesterday, so when you publish that data set, Workday creates a data source and all
Yes.
your restrictions apply on the data source. So this works exactly in the same manner as your normal data sources work, right? Okay.
Those restrictions can be defined by us or by the security team. If we
uh,
create a PDS,
they can be, see, so when I worked on it, so I was also managing security, so I had designed the security as well. But
okay,
usually if you are not dealing with security, then security team can be looped in and they would be the one
okay,
who can, because it has to
mhm,
also align with the overall your global security strategies, right? You may only have Prism view of security, but overall you need to understand the security framework which is used in your project.
yes, got it.
Okay, so applying security to the published data, it ensures that data have the proper restrictions when viewed in a report. So ultimately your restrictions are only applicable on your report. So even when you're viewing your Prism data, you're ultimately viewing it through reporting, because finally once you have published your data and it has created your data source, then you view your data through various visualizations. Now you create advanced reports, matrix reports, scorecards to visualize that data. Okay, so Workday applies the security to the published data in the form of a Prism data source. So Workday creates a Prism data source and there it applies security to the published data. Okay, now there are more details to be spoken about in terms of publishing a data and Prism data source. I'll talk about that in a bit. However, if you don't apply any security, so if I don't apply any security to my DDS01, let's look at lineage first and confirm this is what we need. All right, so this is my DDS01. Uh, so let's say I want to publish this. Okay, so I am in the tenant.
Now, yeah, I can see the tenant. Yeah.
Okay, so there could be a lag. I don't know.
Yep.
All right, so I am looking at this DDS01, right? And if you look at the DDS01, this is our final derived data set, which has all the fields. This is currently not published and the data source security is not applied. So even if I have not applied any data source security, when I publish a data source, right? And I do that by clicking on publish. If you see, Workday applies an implicit security, and the security it applies is Prism default to dataset access. Make sense?
Yes. So currently we don't have any security groups assigned to this.
At this
It's
point in time, I have not defined any explicit security,
okay.
right? Even if no explicit security has been applied, and we'll talk about how we apply this security by applying security. When we publish a dataset, Workday still applies an implicit security. And what is that security? If I click on it, Prism default to dataset access. So this is the default security that would be applied. The dataset will be published and the security listed here will apply to the Prism data source. Now what is this Prism default to dataset access? So because you have not applied any explicit security, and when I publish this data source, Workday would go ahead and create a Prism data source, right? On that Prism data source, Workday would still apply this domain security. And what is that domain security? Prism default to dataset access. So this security is basically saying by default, if you have your dataset access, then you'll be able to view the data source. Okay.
Yes.
So Workday, so when you publish a data set, what does Workday do? Workday creates the Prism data source, right? Okay, then loads it with the transformed data. What transformed data? Which is there in your data set, and applies the appropriate security restrictions to this data. So three things happen. First, Workday creates a Prism data source, similar to how we have Workday delivered data sources, loads this data source with the transform data which is there in your data set, and then applies the security restrictions that you have applied, right? However, if no security has been applied, which means explicit security, Workday applies the implicit security using domain Prism default to dataset access.
Okay. So does this dataset has some limited restrictions? It's a
No,
default one. So, yeah, okay.
no, no. Uh, this has restrictions in the sense, again, as I mentioned. So what is this security access doing? It is basically saying that the security of the data set, sorry. So again, I have my data set. I'm going to publish this data set. Once I publish this data set, Workday creates a Prism data source. This point is clear?
Yes.
Okay. Now on this data source, Workday is applying security through this domain. Okay. I could have applied explicit security, but I didn't. So on this data source that Workday created, it is applying security through this domain. And what does it mean? It basically means only those people who have access to the underlying data set, which means the access to this data source will default to the data set access. So what does it mean? Only those people who have the data set access or the underlying data set access which was published, they will be able to access the data source. So
Okay.
there's no
Got
restriction. The
yeah.
restrictions are only in terms of security, right? And that is the implicit security that Workday is applying.
Got it.
All right. So that is the implicit security that Workday applies. Okay, now let's look at, and finally, once that security is applied, then I can go ahead and create reports. Okay, now there are two types of security. One thing is the security with respect to the data sets itself, right? And the security with respect to the published data. So how can I control who has access to the data in the data set, which is your base data sets and derived data set? By two ways. by giving them access to view, create or manage datasets, or by a owner of the dataset sharing that dataset, which is dataset sharing. So let's say this is my dataset, which is my final dataset. I want to share this dataset with some other user. So I can go to the additional actions and security, and this is my data source security, which is access to my Prism data source. But this is my data set security, in the sense I am sharing this data set with other users. So at this point in time, I have not shared this data set with anyone, which means only I have access to this data set, or all Prism administrators have access to this data set. I want to share this data set with Steve Morgan or some other user. So I can share this data set. Okay, so the first aspect is data set sharing. So the idea is sharing a data set is a way to control access to the individual data sets. All right. Okay. Now, when I share a data set, I can give two types of permissions. Okay, so let me come here, sharing and edit dataset sharing. And here, this dataset, if you see, okay, the dataset owner is Logan McNeil. Obviously, she's the one who has created this dataset. Similar to how we created organizations in Workday, and I automatically become the owner. But now I can go ahead and share this dataset. And when I share this dataset, I can give other permissions. So I can only share this dataset in dataset view mode. I can share this dataset in edit mode, or I can make someone else the dataset owner, right? So when I share this dataset in view mode, the person to whom, or the security group to, if you see, I can share it to users or security groups. So the person or the security group to whom I am sharing this dataset would be only able to view this dataset.
Okay, so it's like Google Drive, like if we are sharing the permissions,
Exactly.
it's okay.
Exactly. Okay. Now these permissions are again configured using maintain assignable roles. So let me search for, let's say, comp admin. Okay, let me search for manager. All right, if you see, the moment I search for manager, system automatically assigns this role to this user. I'm not able to search for a manager role. Let me see if I can search for HR partner. Again, I'm not able to share this with HR partner. This is because in maintain assignable roles, we define so if I search for data set. Okay, so dataset viewer, dataset owner, dataset editor. If I scroll to the right, if you see all these roles, they are only restricted to data analyst. That is why when I selected the option and see which security group this can be shared with, it only gave me data analyst. So I can basically say to which role, and this is security related configuration. I'm not sure if you have seen this, but this is where we define the configuration of role-based security groups. So what we are saying is this role can only be shared with a data analyst or someone who's a data analyst. It says role assignees are only restricted to either all data analysts or those people who have the data analyst role. So that's why when I go to data catalog and select any one of these, if I go in here, allowed user based security groups, if you see only data analyst is there. Let me see if I can assign it to HR administrator. HR administrator is displayed, but it gives me an error. It says role assignees must be the current member of security group specified in the role assignees restricted to column in the maintain assignable roles. Make sense?
Yes.
So if they're in security, my security team is controlling who can I share this data set with, right? And then if I'm owner of that data set, I can share it with one or more users, one or more security groups, provided my data set can be shared with those security groups. And how is this controlled? Using the maintain assignable roles task. All right. Okay. The second thing, if I go ahead and share a data set, right? All data sets up to that point will have to be shared. So if you see, only if I have to share this derived data set, right, with someone, that person should also have access to all the data sets which are feeding into this data set, right? Okay. However, if I take this base data set, let me take this as an example. And here, let me click on view. So this is earlier I was looking at the derived data set, the final data set. Now, if I go to security, if you see, I'll have to basically, if I have to share that derived data set with someone, I'll also have to share all the base data sets feeding into that derived data set. All right.
Yes.
Okay. Now let's go ahead and, so this is the first level of Workday security, which basically controls who has access to the data in the data sets itself, or who has access to those data sets. Now the second level of Workday security, it basically applies to your published data set, which is basically your data source security. Now this, before I go ahead and publish a data set, obviously this is my base data set. I'm not going to publish it. This is my derived data set. We already know, or this is the data set which I'm going to finally publish. We already know that even if we don't apply any security, Workday is any which way is going to apply an implicit security. But still, I can go ahead and define an explicit security. And how do I do that? By going to the additional actions, security, edit data source security. So this is data set sharing, but this security that I'm going to apply, it would apply on the data source which will get created when this particular data set will be published.
Okay.
All right. So when I go to security, I can define the data source security. Why is this data source security? Because this security would again only apply on the data source which will get created if I go ahead and publish this particular data set. Okay, so now I'm coming here and I can define the data source security. So data source security, similar to how we define in reporting, we define data source security either for the entire data source or for specific rows or columns of data. So how do I control any security in Workday? I control this through domains, right? So for example, what am I saying? This particular data source which will get created, it will be secured by, let's say, a custom domain. Now there are, Workday has already given us a lot of custom domains which we can use for different purposes. So let's say I'm saying this particular data source will be secured by custom domain number 103. Now to this custom domain, then your security team will give the relevant permissions. Let's say this domain, your security team wants to share with Steve Morgan and Betty Liu. So are you aware of the security architecture?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so this is how Workday security architecture works. The first level of Workday security architecture is a security group. What is a security group? For example, we just saw data analyst. I showed you HR administrator, and the moment
Yes.
right, those are all security groups. So what is a security group? Okay, so a security group is basically a group of users who need same access. A security group is a grouping of users that has been created for giving them certain access. So HR manager and compensation partner and data analyst and data administrator, these are all security groups in Workday. Okay, so
Yes.
let's say you and I need access to same data. Let's say we are both data analysts in terms of our roles or our responsibility, which means we need data access to data and Prism data and stuff. So what would be done? A security group would be created. Let's say it is ABC security group, and you and I, we would be both grouped into that security group or become members of that security group.
Okay.
Right, so security group once again is a grouping of users who need same access. Now all Workday data, when I say all Workday data, all of Workday objects, they are secured in different domains. So what is a domain? A domain, similar to how security group is a grouping of users who need certain access or same access, a domain is a grouping of related secured items or securable items. What is a domain? A domain is a grouping of related securable items. So what are securable items in Workday? Basically everything in Workday is a securable item. You need access to some report, it is a securable item. You need access to certain task, it is a securable item. You need access to a data source, it is a securable item. You need access to a field, let's say date of birth of the employee, it is a securable item, right? So what Workday has done is it has given us a lot of standard domains, and these domains are collection of securable items. Now let's say I need access to a securable item called create supervisory org, which is a task. Now this task is included in a domain. So now I would be added to a security group, or both of us will be added to a security group. Let's call it ABC, right? In which we have two employees. Now both of us, they need access to the task create supervisory organization. This is a task which is secured in a domain. Let's say domain SCSO, right? I'm taking random. So now this security group would be given access to this domain, and this is given through domain security policy permissions. Make sense,
Yes.
right? So once again, The security group that I am a member of, that security group would be given access to different domains. Once that happens, the members of this or if I put it the other way, security group is given access to different domains. Once that happens, the members of that security group will be able to access the secured items within that domains or within those domains.
Yes, got it.
Make sense? Okay,
Yep.
now what are we doing? We have this secured item that we are going to create, which is a Prism data source. So Prism data source is again a secured item, just like a normal data source, just like a report, just like a task. So Prism data source is a secured item. So what are we doing? We are saying this secured item, which is the data source which will get created, we are securing it within a custom domain. And the domain is custom domain 103. This could be any other. I'm just taking this as an example. So what am I saying? Because this is my custom object I have created. This is not a Workday delivered data source. This custom data source that I have created, I am securing it to this domain, which is custom domain 103. Now, let's say all data analysts need access to this. So all data analysts, they need access to this Prism data source because they would be creating these reports. So data analyst, I have 10 data analysts. I have employee 1, employee ABC, and so on and so forth. So all these people who need access to this Prism data source, they are grouped together using a security group called data analyst. This could be anything else. This could be data admin. This could be ABC admin. I can give it any name. So now I have grouped all those people who need access to this Prism data source using a security group. This Prism data source, I'm securing it within this domain. Now this security group, I will give access to this domain again through domain security permission.
Okay.
Make sense? So all I'm doing here is that I'm saying the data source which will get created, I am securing the data source in this domain, because everything you need to access in Workday, it has to be secured through a domain. And then you access the secured items in that domain through your security group. So you cannot be given, employee 1 cannot be directly given access to a domain. For that, employee 1 has to be included in a security group. So even if there's just one employee, let's say there's just one data analyst in the system who needs access to Prism, even then I'll have to include that employee in a security group. Similarly, even if there is only one secured item, I'll have to include that secured item into a domain. Make sense?
Yes, got it.
So this is your entire data source security. Okay, this applies. So this security applies to the entire Prism data source. So your data source security. So your data source security may apply to the entire data source, right? Which is basically what you control through the domain. Or you can also do a contextual security. So for example, I have access to not, let's look at a normal report. So I have access to a report to view compensation details, whereas you also have access to the same report. When I run this report, I'll be able to only view compensation details for my own direct employees. Whereas when you run this report, you are managing, let's say, Hyderabad India team. You'll be able to view compensation details of Hyderabad in India team. Whereas when I run the same report, I'll only be able to view details of Mumbai India team because I manage Mumbai India team. So if you see on a report, we apply contextual security. So it doesn't mean if I have access to the data source, I can see all data in the data source. Now that contextual security or that row level security can be done through the securing entities. So if I just give the domain here, I'm basically saying any members of the security group would have access to all data in the data source. But then I can define a row level security. And how do I control that? By specifying securing entities. Okay, I'm not sure why it doesn't show securing entities. Okay, so what is a securing entity? A securing entity is an organization. So when you go to securing entity, system would basically see, let me select, let's say worker. Okay, let me take this. I'm not sure why it doesn't show any securing entities. Okay, so what does system do? It basically checks in your data set and sees how many organizations are there in your data set. Now in my data set, if you remember, I have company as well as supervisory org. So here it will allow me to select either company or supervisory org or any other organization, let's say location. And this allows me to define the contextual security. So let's say here I select location. So what is the idea? The idea is only those people who have access to the location, or I would only be able to access the data in this data source, which is for employees who belong to the same location as I am. So this is basically contextual security, wherein you want to apply a row level security.
Yep.
All right. So there are two types of securities I can define. I can give you access to the entire domain or the entire data source, or I can also restrict your access by specifying certain organization. So let's say supervisory org, or let's say location. So now I am the HR partner of Hyderabad location. When I run, or when I in this data source, if I'm securing it with a location, when I run or when I view this data source or run a report which is based on this data source, I'll only be able to see the details of those employees who belong to Hyderabad location or Mumbai location. So I can secure it using any securing entities. I'm not sure why this doesn't display. Actually, it should show me all the fields here. So I should be able to select the fields. I'm not sure what is the issue. Maybe I don't have security, but then it should show me all the fields. This is strange.
If we select a different domain, will it populate or?
No, it should populate the moment I select it, open it. It's not dependent on my domain. Domain is something I'm applying later, right? It should actually automatically populate. So all these fields, and it should give me these as the securing entity. I don't know, maybe I don't have the relevant access. Mm, let's publish this data set and then we'll see. So I'm publishing it with default and submitting it.
So we're publishing the DDS 01, not 03, right?
No, because DDS
Okay,
01
yeah.
is my final one, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
Everything feeds into DDS 01. So if I look at the lineage, this is my final, right? Everything feeds into it. So let's see what has happened once again. Okay, this will take a while to publish. So what is happening when I'm publishing a data set? It would create a data source, and all the data in my data set will be loaded with it, with the data, or all the data in my data set will get loaded into the data source which gets created. Okay, so I think this will take a minute. Let me just have some water. Okay, 50% then. So similar to how we created a schedule, a integration schedule for loading data, exactly similar to that, we can also create a published schedule. Just
Okay.
look at that. Let's let this load. Okay, so while this loads, let me show you. So once a data source is created, you would be able to look at that data source. And there is this task, which is Prism Datasource. So you can go here and see all the Prism data sources. So this is that report. You can see these are all the Prism data sources which are created,
Yep.
right? And people have, if you see, secured these data sources through these domains. And then if you see, these are because custom domains, no one has access to these domains. So what people did, I could have also done that right now, right? I could have selected a custom domain. And so what is happening? This data source, it is secured by these domains. But currently no security groups have access to those domains. But
Okay.
these are because Workday delivered domains, already there are security groups which have access to these domains. When I'm saying this data source is secured by these two domains, these security groups, because they already have access to these domains, any members of this security group would be able to see these domains. Okay,
Okay.
so if I go in here, let's see, right? So this is the data set and the name of the data source would be exactly same. So if I go to this data set, right? So this has created this data source and it is published. So again, if I want, I can security and edit data source security. Okay, this is actually an issue. It should show me all the field types. I don't know why it doesn't show, and it should show me the securing entities as well. I'll have to check. right? So system finally creates a Prism data source, right? That Prism data source is secured by your domain, and to that domain you give access to different security groups. So let's go to our data catalog and see what is happening with our data source. Okay, it is published. Workday has created this data source. Now, if I go to this data source, if you see, this is exactly similar to how a normal data source. So all the fields are part of this data source, right? Which means now I can go ahead and create a custom report. So if I go to the task, create custom report, not sure, all custom reports or all Prism data sources are indexed. Now I can take this data source and create a custom report.
And this custom report can be anything, advanced metrics.
Yes, it could be advanced, it could be metrics, it can now be transposed. I'll give you that list, right? It could be a discovery board and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Okay, all right, let's go back to the data catalog. Now, as I discussed, this is the first time I have published this data set. So what happened when I published this data set? Workday created the Prism data sources. When it created the Prism data source, it loaded all the transform data, right? And applied the security restrictions. Now, but if you see, my data will keep changing, right? So initially there were in there I had 100 workers. I created a custom report which got all those 100 workers. Through that I created a BDS. From that BDS it created a DDS, again a DDS, and finally I have published my data set, which become my PDS. And this created a data source, and this has all those 100 records. But tomorrow or 1 week down the line, I have hired 10 more employees. So now I have 110 workers in my data source, right? Now my custom BDS runs. This BDS has 110 workers. This new data flows in here, from here, here, here. But then this data, which is now in my published data source, it won't be automatically available, or my published data set, it will not be automatically available in my data source. So in order to make the new data available in my data source, I'll have to republish it. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So for that, again, no one is sitting and going to manually publish it every day, right? So for that, I can, similar to how we create integration schedules for getting data, we can also create integration schedules for publishing data. So for publishing, I can create a schedule, right? So that, let's say every day, this data source, this Prism data set will let's say every week or every month based on my requirement, I'll say this Prism data set automatically gets republished. When it gets republished, any new data which is there would automatically become available in my data source,
Okay.
right? So for that, I will have to create a schedule to publish my data set. Now for that, if you see, I can create a publish schedule to run it daily, weekly, or monthly. Now this is straightforward. Let's say I want to run it on a weekly basis. I'll say okay. Now here I'll define the schedule. So I want it to run every 1 week, or let's say every 2 weeks, or which is every alternate week. Every alternate week, let's say on a Wednesday, or let's say on a Saturday, right? With a start time, time zone, catch up behavior, start date, and end date. and then I can define a priority. Workday basically uses this priority. So if there are lots of jobs, Workday then prioritizes those schedules based on the priority. So if I'm
Okay.
saying normal, if there is heavy load, system would basically go ahead and not run anything which is low. But anything is critical, Workday would first prioritize, because everything is, if you see, is ultimately running in through Workday, right? We don't have any servers of our own. It is Workday which is running everything, right? On their own servers, on their databases. So they're not just running for our company. They're doing it for all the clients, right? So the data load is not just with respect to our company. It could be on other clients, from other clients as well. Okay. All right. So there are these options wherein I can schedule it on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, or I can create a dependent schedule as well. So if you see, apart from these daily and weekly options, there is one more option. Okay. And that option is, if I go back, publishing, create schedule, I can create a dependent schedule. So what is a dependent schedule? If you see, my publishing of this data set is dependent on new data coming in, right? So if there is no, and when will new data come in? When I have scheduled this or run this integration. Make sense? So when I run this integration for base data set, only the new data will come in from custom report. Make sense?
Yes.
Right? So I want to create a dependent schedule, because if there's no new data which is coming in, why do I want to republish? Because there wouldn't be anything in my data set. So I'm
Yeah.
creating a dependent schedule. Dependent on what? Dependent on, now there are two things. If I go to type, if I come here, if you see data acquisition process, what is the data acquisition process? Basically, this is where my data set data is being acquired, right? Which is
Mhm.
basically my BDS for a custom report or a BDS for an SFTP. So my schedule could be dependent on a date, though it shows everything. These are the only things which are relevant. It could be dependent on a data acquisition process, or maybe I want to publish this data set if some other data set is published. So what am I saying? After this, let's look at the first one. If this data acquisition process, and we have not scheduled anything, there could be something which is scheduled by someone else. So let's say this integration schedule, only if this data acquisition schedule, if it is successfully completed, then trigger my publishing, let's say after a delay of 2 hours, just to make sure everything is all right. So this publishing would happen after my data acquisition has been successfully completed. Make sense? Or I can also say this publishing should happen after some ABC data set has been published. So I can depend it on data acquisition schedule or some other Prism process which is running.
Okay.
Right? So your Prism data sources are always published, because no one is going to sit and manually publish them every day as the data changes. All right. Now, if you want to unpublish, now let's say I have created this is my Prism data source. Using this Prism data sources, people have created a number of reports, right? And then I can go ahead and unpublish my Prism data source. So when I go to the additional actions, publishing, unpublish a data set. When I unpublish a data set, it will show me all the dependent reports. So how many reports have been created using this data source, right? So what happens if there are, let's say, 10 reports that people have built using this Prism data source, but now I go ahead and unpublish this data set. So when I unpublish a data set, my data source gets removed, and all the reports, they would give me error. If I go ahead and republish this data set, then the data source gets recreated, and then the reports will start working once again. But system would not stop me from unpublishing it. So it will not say because you have reports created, first delete those reports. No. Even if there are dependent reports, you can still unpublish a data set.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yep.
So a data set can be unpublished even if there are reports in dependent on it. As long as there are reports, as long as the data set is not published, system would give me error for the reports, or basically I'll not be able to run those reports. So Prism data source, right? We already know when a data set is published, Workday creates a Prism data source and loads it with the transformed data from the data set, right? These Prism data sources are different, or they are similar but also different from Workday data sources. How are they different? The first one is these are custom data sources, obviously. Right? Now, all data sources, if you know, are based on a business object. So these data sources, what is the business object they are linked with? Let me cancel it. So if I open this data source, is it based on any business object?
No, but I can see a related business object.
Okay. So let me create a custom report. These are always indexed. You know the difference between an indexed and a, right?
Yeah, in indexed we get limited number of data fields.
Yeah, indexed is basically optimized for performance.
Yep.
Right? So all Prism data sources are indexed. And that's why even with this checkbox selected, I'm able to select a Prism data source.
Okay.
Okay, let me click on OK. Now, what is the business object? Let's see.
Yeah, the same name as of our DDS data source.
Right? So Prism data sources, they have their own primary BO. Right? The third thing, unlike a Workday delivered data source, a Prism data source can have their data removed by unpublishing the data set, right? So the moment you unpublish the data set, all data in the data source gets removed,
Okay.
right? So when a data set is unpublished, all reports that use it will be broken, right? Obviously they wouldn't work because there's no data until the Prism data source is populated again. How do you populate it again? by
I
republish, right? Obviously, unlike a data source, normal data source, you can delete it. How do you delete it? By unpublishing. We cannot go ahead and delete a Workday delivered data source.
Okay. Yeah.
Can only support some report types. What are the report types that they support? So they basically support advanced, they support matrix,
Transpose.
simple, composite, and transposed. They do not support trending report, for example, and they also discovery boards, obviously. Okay, the next thing is they only support. Now if you see, once I have the data source created, in my custom report that I'm building from this data source, I can again build calculated fields, right? Okay,
Yep.
so they only support some field types. So again, they do not support, for example, date time fields and calculated fields. So they only support some calculated fields. So for example, they don't support multi-instance field in all examples. They don't support date time calculations. They only support date calculations and so on and so forth. So there's a list available and I would share that list. Obviously, this list it keeps getting updated in every enhancement. I'll share
Okay.
across that list, right? And if you have access to community, you'll find this list in community itself,
Okay.
right? Okay. What else? Now, what happens is, if you want, you can, let's view this data set. So if you, by mistake, you loaded some incorrect data in your data set, right? You can delete that data in the data set, or you can truncate the data in the data set. So oh, what happened? Hmm, okay. Hmm, let's again take this one. Okay. So, and this is especially relevant for append mode. So what is truncate? Truncate will basically remove all data from the data set. Okay. So all the data in the data set can be deleted by truncate option. Now the reason I only have truncate is because the integration mode is replace. Had the integration mode been append, in addition to truncate, I would have the additional option called delete as well. So delete is you only want to delete data from the last integration run, right? So truncate will delete all data from the data set and delete will only delete data for the last integration run. Now delete is obviously only relevant when you have append mode,
Okay.
Okay, so let's say you are using this data set for the last 6 months or last 1 year. Now this latest integration run, there was some error. So you only want to delete the data from the last integration run. Then you use the delete option. When you say truncate, it will delete all data which has been loaded in the last 1 year.
And delete will appear only if the integration mode is append.
Append, yeah.
Okay. And if any of the field, if we are deleting any of the field from derived data set, okay, will it impact our data source?
From the derived data set, no, because it's
No.
downstream, right? Your
Yeah.
data source, if you make changes to the data source, then your data sets will get impacted, right? Because from
Okay.
data source, data is coming into data set, right?
Okay. Yep.
After you make data is in data set, if you make any changes to the data set, it doesn't impact your data source.
Okay, got it.
Okay, let me show you the discovery board as well, right? Now for discovery board, first thing to remember, discovery board is accessed through drive, right? Now drive doesn't work. So one thing to remember is that drive doesn't work in in what do I say, in proxy mode. So if I come here and go to drive, it says drive doesn't support proxy access. You have to stop proxy. So if you want access uh, to the discovery boards, you would need access to drive, right? And just like everything else, access to drive is through domain. So everything that you need access to, always remember, you need access to the relevant domains, because all objects, all tasks, all reports are hidden in domains. So there's a report which is called all domains. This, you can run this report, right? And this will show you all the domains. Now I want to know which domain drive is located. Let quickly search for drive. There are some drive related options. Let's see. So drive, this domain provides access to the new drive user interface. So if I need access to this drive interface, then I should have access to this domain. How would I get access to this domain? Through the security group that I belong to. So if I open this domain called drive, as I mentioned, every domain is a collection of secured items. So every domain is a collection of secured items. Those secured items could be reports, they could be tasks, they could be fields, they could be anything. Now these are the security groups. If I go in here, these are the security groups that currently have access to this domain, which is drive, which means they would have access to all the secured items within this domain, right? So the reason I am able to access this drive is because I belong to one of these security groups. In fact, this user is an HR administrator. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So let's go to drive. Now your access to discovery boards is enabled through drive. So I want to create a new discovery board. I'll click on add new and I'll create a new discovery board. I'll give a name to my discovery board. So I'll call it Web 7. Create. Okay, now what is a discovery board? A discovery board is, it corresponds to a dashboard. So just like on our dashboard, we can have multiple reports. In a discovery board, we can have multiple visualizations, right? Each visualization is a report. And then just like on a dashboard, we can add multiple tabs. Similarly, in a discovery board, I can add multiple sheets. So this is my sheet 1, which I'm probably calling as employee metrics, right? And I can add a new sheet by clicking on plus. And this sheet, I want to call it as organization metrics, and so on and so forth. So our discovery board is a collection of one or multiple sheets. Each sheet is a collection of one or multiple visualizations. What is a visualization? A visualization allows you to visualize data. Now, just like we create custom reports using data sources, we create our visualizations in a discovery board using data source. Now here you'll see I can search for my Prism data source. So just like I can search for a Prism data source to create a custom report, an advanced report, a matrix report, similar to that, I can select a, a custom Prism data source to build my visualizations. So the first thing, in a discovery board, you have sheets. Each sheet has visualizations. Okay. Then
Okay.
on the left hand side, you have 3 panels. The first one is the data source panel, and currently only data source panel is highlighted. The second one, it is not highlighted, is the builders panel. And the third one is the filter panel. So first you select your data source in the data source panel. Then you build your visualization through builder panel, and you can add additional filters. So for now, I'm selecting this data source, or I could have selected a Workday delivered data source, for example, workers for HCM reporting. So just like I can select a Workday delivered data source, I can select a, a, a Prism data source. Now this Workday delivered data source, it has its own inbuilt filters. So for example, I want to build a report for all active workers or all workers which is active and inactive, and there are other filters available. So this is my data source filter. I'm selecting OK. So I'm applying. Now the moment I apply, if you see now my builder panel is highlighted.
Yep. So we are again selecting the data source from our first panel.
Yeah, yes. So I'm selecting data source from the first panel.
Okay.
So first we select data source. Only after we have selected the data source, we'll be able to select the fields in the data source.
Okay.
Right. So now because I have selected this data source, or let me come back and change my data source. So I'll go back and I want to change my data source. So this is my data source. I'm selecting this as my data source. Next. And now in this data source, if you remember, we had all these fields: additional job count, age group,
Yes.
right? Okay, now I want to build a simple matrix. So this is my field selection area within the builder panel, and this is my drop zone. Okay, in drop zone, we select the type of the report. So the default report that is selected is an advanced report or a table. So if I click here, the default report type is a table, which is a type of advanced report. Okay, so here, let's say I want to build some metrics. Metrics is worker name. I'll select here, drag and drop, right? The workers, let's say gender. Where is gender? Uh, Gender. Why is that I'm not able to access? Okay, then hire date. If you see, I'm simply building an advanced report.
Yeah.
right? Okay, I want to get their management level and so on and so forth. And I also want to get the worker ID. Where is worker ID? Employee, plan name, supervisory org name. Didn't we select worker ID? Where should be
We
worker ID?
have employee ID.
Where is it? Oh yes.
Yeah.
So I want to add employee ID at the top. Okay, now if you see, there are a lot of workers who don't have employee ID, who don't have uh, worker name. So there is blank data. I want to put a filter, and I'm coming to the filter panel. There are two types of filters I can build. I can build a filter specific to this visualization, or I can build a filter for the whole sheet. For now, I only want to build a filter for this particular visualization. And I'm basically saying, only get me those values from the data source wherein employee ID is not blank. When I do that, now my visualization refreshes and I want to save my visualization. All right. So I have created a simple report, a simple visualization. I want to create a new one. Now there are two options. Either I can go here and create a duplicate one. When I create a duplicate one, system would automatically copy everything from this visualization. In the data source, everything. Let's say I want to create a data source, a visualization on a, or let's look at both ways. So I want to create a duplicate one. When I click it, system creates a new one. Here I'm calling it employee details, right? This visualization I'm calling it, let's say gender details. Okay, the first thing now I want to do is I want to go back to my builders panel. This is the second one. I want to change the report type and I'm selecting, let's say, chart. Now the moment I select chart, Workday has added in my drop zone a lot of extra fields. So what I want is, I don't want this, I don't want this, I don't want hire date, I don't want management level. So based on the chart or the report type you select, Workday automatically updates the drop zone. Now there are
Yeah.
two types of fields. One is your attribute fields. So gender, if you see, is an attribute of a business object of a worker, right? Similarly, management level is an attribute. And then there are second type of fields which are called summarization field. So count, if you see, we never added count as a field, right? In our Prism data source, Workday has automatically added this count. So what is count? Count is basically a summarization. What am I doing? I'm getting a count of the females, males, and blank. So this summarization Workday automatically added. But let's say, how do I add my own summarizations? So what Workday does is every currency or numeric field, Workday automatically creates the summarization field. So once again, there are two types of fields. Attribute, if you see, this is an attribute. Additional job count. Now, if you see the difference, age group, when I bring my cursor here, this is how it looks. When I bring my cursor here, Workday adds this double chevron. When I click here, so wherever Workday finds a numeric field or a currency field, Workday automatically defines these summarization values. Similarly, if I come to this, again, if you see, Workday has automatically added summarization values. Age, where is age? Age group is not a numeric field. So there's no summarization that Workday has added. So any numeric or currency field, Workday automatically adds these summarizations. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay, now the default summarization that Workday is showing is count. Let's say for each of these genders, I want to get the sum of the additional jobs that they are doing. So now I can bring this summarization. Now based on whether I'm selecting an attribute or a summarization field, you see that certain areas are grayed out or highlighted. So because I'm pulling a summarization field, only this area is highlighted. I cannot place it here. But if I pull the additional job, that can be placed here. So certain drop zones are only applicable for attribute, and additional job count is an attribute. How many additional jobs do I have? That is my attribute. But the average additional jobs across males, that is not an attribute. That is a grouping.
Yep.
So now I want to get, let's say, the sum of average job. When I do that, system removes the default summarization of count, and it is now showing that the sum of additional jobs in females is 12, in males it is 11, and there is just probably one additional job for blank. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay, now I can also define additional parameters. So let's say I want to get not just age, for not just gender, for each of these genders, I also want to understand the management level. So I'm bringing it here, and management level, again, this is an attribute. So I can either place it on axis or I can place it on color. When I place it on color, right? So now what is system doing? For each of these genders, system is showing the management level of the employees. So out of, let's say, all these females, how many are, so when I bring my cursor here, there are 4 vice presidents, and there are 8 individual contributors, and there are 6 managers. Make sense?
Yes.
So discovery boards, they are very simple, right? If you see, it is simply drag and drop. I can save this. Okay, just give me 1 second.
Uh,
Now, if you see, this report type is of type chart, but it shows me matrix. Whereas this visualization type, when I click here and go to here, it is of type advanced. So why is it called an advanced? Why is these called matrix? The idea is, now I have created everything. I can now go ahead and export this discovery board or this visualization. When I export it, Workday would create a custom report, right? So if I export this visualization, Workday would create a report of type advanced. Whereas when I export this visualization, Workday would create a report of type matrix, right? So when I export this visualization, which is of type table, Workday creates a custom report which is of type advanced. Whereas when I export these 3 visualization, Workday creates a matrix report. Whereas these visualizations, they cannot be exported. So that is what Workday is using this grouping for. Okay, that is why it is referred to as an advanced report, whereas this is referred to as a matrix report. So now if I go ahead and export it, export as a report, I can give the report name, export it. I can view it. If you see, Workday has created a matrix report for me, and I can go ahead and modify that matrix report. Make sense?
yes.
So this matrix report is based on this Prism data source, the Prism business object, and these are those groupings. I'm getting the gender, and for that gender, I'm getting the sum of additional job count.